Have you ever felt abandoned by the people around you? Well, what about if you were part of a country, an entire nation of people who felt forgotten? Join me as we talk about a historical story of an entire nation of people who felt forgotten by the people around them and by their God, and the amazing way where they found out that God had never abandoned them the whole time. Imagine with me, if you will, that you are a Jew, an Israelite, living in the Holy Land in the 1st century AD. We're talking more than 2,000 years ago. You live in relative poverty, but you also belong to a large, multi-generational family. And because you live in a large, multi-generational family, you live together, you work together, and you socialize together. And because none of you are wealthy, you're there for each other. Because the Israel of today isn't like the Israel of your ancestors. You are not free in any sense of the word, because you are part of the Roman Empire. They make the laws and they control so much of your everyday life. But the truth is, you really haven't been free for a long time. The Romans, well, they're just only the latest in a long line of pretenders and conquerors laying claim to your country, to your ancestral home. And who knows, maybe the Romans, they'll be around for another 1,000 years, or maybe their empire will crumble tomorrow. This is your daily experience. You're kind of used to being told what to do. You're kind of used to not being in charge, but that doesn't mean that you like it. But you put up with it, you and your people, because the thing that truly matters to you is not the Roman Empire or any who came before it. There's something that matters to you far more than that, and that is your faith in God. See, because over the generations, the story that has been told by your father, by your grandfather, and by his father before him has been the same. No matter the ups and the downs, the empires that have come and gone, the violence and the abuse perpetrated by people against you and your people have held true and held faith to a story. It's a story about the Anointed One, the Messiah. For generations, you and your people have hoped for the day that somebody, an appointed person from God himself, is going to come into your world and is going to change everything. This is the story of redemption, the story of justice, of the people who are evil and the oppressors and the empires getting their due, and you and your people being rescued from slavery, from oppression, and from abuse. But here's the irony. When the calendar rolled over from 1 BC to 1 AD, no one really took any notice. Well, you didn't notice either, because why would you? By all accounts, this year should be no different to the year that came before it. You have no idea that future generations would look back to this time, would look back to this year as the hinge of history. Because in a small village, in a tiny corner of Israel, a child is about to be born. A child who will change your world and the greater world forever. Now, we're going to hit pause for just a moment because we need to understand the testimony of one obscure author writing one obscure book that ended up in my Bible and yours today. The final book of the Nevi'im, also known as the prophets, and of the Hebrew Bible, which is what Christians call the Old Testament, is the book of Malachi. Who is Malachi? Well, the name itself, Malachi, simply means my messenger. And there are many scholars today who believe that Malachi, he may not have been a real person, he may have been, but he may not have been, and that the book possibly could have been written by Ezra the scribe. That's crucial because this book was probably definitely written around the time when your people, the Jews, were in exile in Persia and were just beginning to return to Israel for the first time in 70 years. In this cultural moment, figures like Ezra, figures like Nehemiah, figures that you may have heard about growing up, they have been given hope to the people of a restored kingdom. But nevertheless, even though they have this hope that we're going to return from exile, we're going to return from enslavement, times are tough. In short, here is what has happened in the story so far. In the 6th century BC, King Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon invaded the kingdom of Judah, and he destroyed it completely. He went through town after town, village after village, conquering and killing wherever he went, and when he got to the capital of Jerusalem, he leveled that city too. He killed the king, he killed many of the royal family, and he also carted off almost all the people still alive as slaves back to Babylon. Babylon was an empire built, like many before it and many after it, on the back of slaves. But what's particularly offensive and particularly disturbing for you is the fact that not just Jerusalem was destroyed, but your temple, Solomon's temple, the temple that had been the center point for all of your faith and for your entire religion. 70 years have gone by, and Babylon is a thing of the past. It has been conquered by the Medo-Persian Empire. They are the new players in town, and they have come in to Babylon, and there's famous stories about this, and they have destroyed Babylon, they have usurped its empire, and they are the ones now in charge. And what they've inherited is not just the Babylonian Empire, but also all of Babylon's problems. All of the many different people groups that were within the Babylonian Empire at the time are now not subjects of Babylon, but subjects of Persia. And as the story goes on, we see many different stories of how God's people interact with these conquerors and how many amazing things happen in the midst of it. But as time goes on, there is this growing sense of return. We want to go back to our people. And figures like Ezra and Nehemiah, these people are absolute cornerstones in making sure that God's people get to return back to their homeland. And 70 years after Babylon has conquered these people and taken them into captivity, Persia's in charge, and the king, King Cyrus, decides, you know what? I am going to let these people go. And it's interesting to consider why. See, the Persians, they're not like the Babylonians beforehand, and they're not like the Assyrians before them. See, the Assyrians and the Babylonians, they were bloodthirsty conquerors. But the Persians, on the other hand, they wanted to be more moderate, more tolerant, more open-minded. And so to a people group in the Near East, in Mesopotamia, the Persians must have been like a breath of fresh air. Yeah, this is another king, sure, but these guys are different. And so, in 538 BC, Cyrus the Great makes a proclamation that all Jews living in his empire could return to their ancestral homeland. Any who wanted could pick up their stuff, pack up their belongings, take their families, and go back to Jerusalem. And so, it's in this context, in the context of this return from exile, that the book of Malachi is written. And make no mistake, things are not going easy for this ragtag group of Jewish exiles. They have enemies on one side and the other, and they are closing in on every side. These people are a tiny fish in a big pond. But God promises to reward those people who return to faithful covenant relationship with him. This is the promise that God gives to his people again and again and again. He has no issues with pointing out all the ways that the people have kind of failed him. But he says at the end of all of these things, if you return to covenant relationship with me, things are going to go well for you. He also has a bit of a warning right at the very end of Malachi, where he reminds the people what's going to happen if they continue on their path of half-hearted lukewarmness. But then, at the end of this monologue, God offers one piece of hope. And it's found in Malachi 4, verse 5. And it says this, "See," God says, "I will send the prophet Elijah to you before that great and dreadful day of the Lord comes." What's he talking about here? In Jewish thought, they had this concept of the day of the Lord. Sounds really scary, really apocalyptic. And that's because, well, it really is. See, Israel, throughout all of its history, at one point or another, has been subjugated and oppressed by some other power, some other nation. Israel's always kind of been like the plucky underdog, the little fish in a big pond in the midst of this big wide world that they live in. And these nations that would come in, whether it was Egypt, whether it was Moab, whether it was the Philistines, or whether it was Babylon, have always come in as this oppressor, this user. We're just here to take your stuff, to put you to work so that you can be our vassal state, so that we can be your overlord, and so that we can benefit and profit off you. That's kind of how politics, geopolitics worked in the ancient Near East. It was a constant shifting of power between one nation state to another. And if you were on top, you were going to make everyone else pay. And Israel, as I've mentioned, more often than not, was on the receiving end of this oppression. They would often be conquered by another nation, and then God would raise up a hero to rescue them. This had happened time and time again. But there came a point, especially in the Babylonian captivity, where it seemed like God wasn't paying attention, where it seemed like God maybe had forgotten them. And I can't but help think of Jeremiah's writing to the people in captivity in Babylon in chapter 29, where he says, you are going to be there for a while. In fact, he actually says you're going to be there for 70 years. And he tells these people, plant crops, make gardens, marry off your children, settle down and live in the empire, because the empire is going to be in charge for a while. But the other narrative that runs counter to this one is the day of the Lord. Because the day of the Lord is this ultimate final standoff where God himself gets involved in the geopolitics of the world, in the empire builders, and he puts an end to any oppressors, any empire builders, anyone who would seek to oppress and to subjugate the innocent. God would put an end to them completely. And not only would God put an end to them completely, but God would bring retribution and reconciliation to all those who had been stood on by the boot of empire. Any who had been abused, who had been dispossessed, who had been robbed, who had been put into chains would finally get their comeuppance. They would be able to be liberated, to be freed, and finally be able to be gone from their oppressors. This day of the Lord would also mark a transition point, a hinge in history, where all the empire builders and all the oppressors would suddenly lose their power, and where God would come in and establish an eternal kingdom, a kingdom that would never be overthrown, a kingdom that would last into eternity. The Jews of Israel looked forward to not only the humiliation of their oppressors, but the inauguration of this new kingdom. And no doubt many of them remembered the words of the prophet Daniel, who, in interpreting Nebuchadnezzar's dream only a few years before this, had said, "The God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed, nor will it be left to another people. It will crush all those kingdoms and bring them to an end, but it will itself endure forever. In other words, empires, they'll come and go. But when God sets up his kingdom, it will last forever. And as the survivors and the refugees who have just come out of the empire, when they hear these words in the ruins of their city, Jerusalem, these would have been the thoughts they would have conjured up. And now that we've been freed from the yoke of empire, they must have thought, maybe now God is going to do what he said he's going to do. Maybe now he's going to establish his kingdom here. But as the years went on, God did not establish his eternal kingdom. This day of the Lord, often hoped for, it never came. And things didn't get better for these people. In fact, it got much, much worse. Because in 333 BC, Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire, which marked the official end of the exile. And though this might have seemed like a good thing initially, these practices were imposed by these new kings, the Seleucid kings, who became the rulers of Judea after the fall of Alexander's empire. And these new customs slowly eroded what national hope, what national integrity Israel once had. In particular, there's one Seleucid king, Antiochus Epiphanes IV, who became an aggressive oppressor of the Jews after a disputed altercation between him and Jerusalem. This was a bad guy. He defiled the temple system. He forced the priests to eat a pig that had been slaughtered on the altar in the outer court. And he also defaced many, many sacred books with a broth made from the pig, as well as putting out the eternal flame, a lamp that had never been extinguished since the temple, the second temple, had been built. Later on, a deposed priest, a high priest named Jason, he caught wind that the king, Antiochus, had been killed while campaigning in Egypt. And so what did he do? He took 1,000 soldiers and took over Jerusalem, forcing the current high priest, who was appointed by the king, a figurehead, a puppet, to flee. He wanted to establish the new kingdom of God, the kingdom of God on earth. But there's one problem. The king was not dead, and when the very much not dead Antiochus heard about this, he returned in a rage, and he ordered his soldiers to kill anyone they encountered on the way, indiscriminately. In a span of 3 very short days, historians estimate that around 80,000 people in Jerusalem and in the surrounding areas lost their lives. Many of them supporters of Jason the high priest and this new world order, but most of them, tragically, innocent people, women, children, and the elderly. After the collapse of Antiochus's empire, Israel enjoyed a very brief moment of self-governance. But this in and of itself was soon ended with the rise of the Roman Republic, then and pretty soon the Roman Empire. And soon, every Jew from Galilee to Nazareth was under the thumb of yet another empire. And this is a fact that wouldn't change for a very long time. Now, what's most notable for you and for me now is that during this period, a 400-year-long period, God seemed to remain silent. No new books were written, no prophets rose up. Many things happened, but God didn't seem interested at all in participating in any of it. So, let's go back from there and fast forward to the year 1 AD, the year that nobody knew would be 1 AD. And let's go back to the story that remember how we talked about you being a Jew living in the first century? Let's go back to that story. And as you tell the story of the day of the Lord, of the anointed one, the one who is going to come, who is going to overthrow all the empires and who is going to establish an eternal kingdom, you're very much aware that this story is influenced by the many oral traditions of your ancestors, the words of the prophets, and of the debates of the rabbis that you see every week in synagogue. But alongside those traditions and those thoughts would have been a sort of malaise as you think about this story. A thought, as you're telling these stories, no doubt may have crossed your mind that maybe God had abandoned you and all your people. I mean, after all, think about it. Why has no prophet arisen in more than 400 years? And most crucially, why has God allowed his chosen nation to be mistreated so horrendously by foreign power after foreign power? Why? Now, to be sure, all of this has happened before. But in those times, God always had raised up someone, a hero, to save his people. And that just isn't happening anymore. And so you can understand as you tell the stories of your ancestors, of Exodus, of David, of all these heroes who God has used to rescue and save his people, why you might be starting to question in your mind whether God is really good, whether God's really there, whether he's listening, or whether he has abandoned you. What did we do? Are we not good enough? Did God just simply get sick and tired of our idolatry, of our lukewarmness? What is wrong with us? Why has God abandoned us? Imagine how it would have felt as a Jew living in Israel, in the Holy Land, in the promised land that God gave to your ancestors, who said that this is a nation that would bless every nation in the world, and yet you don't seem to be in a position to be able to bless anyone, much less yourself. Why has God abandoned us? But little do you know that as you have these thoughts of self-doubt, of confusion, of abandonment, there is another story being written not too far from you. In fact, in the village of Nazareth, a pretty not nice village, a young woman named Mary has fallen pregnant out of wedlock. And this would have ordinarily been an incredibly taboo thing in her society, if not for the strangest occurrence. Both she and her fiancé, Joseph, are visited by an angel of all people. And this angel tells them that Mary, she's about to give birth to not just a baby boy, but the baby boy who she and all of her people have been waiting for this entire time. The answer to the 400 years of God's silence. And later on, as Matthew, one of Jesus' disciples, is writing the biography of the life of Jesus, he says this, Matthew 1, verse 22 and 23. All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. Jesus enters the scene in the first century. And when he does so, he completely disrupts the story the Jews had been telling. God never abandoned his people. In fact, what he had planned for them was far better than anything they could have ever imagined. And Jesus' coming and his ministry was evidence that God had never abandoned his people. Whereas the people of Israel were hoping for a military figure to save them from the Romans, a politician, a fighter, a warrior, Jesus' scope was far bigger. Jesus came to save those who had been lost, those who had been forgotten, those who had been rejected and abandoned by society. The story that he came to rewrite was simple, that God has not given up on his people. And in fact, that God is so committed to his people that he gave his only son, the one thing that was worth the most to him in all the universe, to do for them what they could not do for themselves. The story of Jesus is good news for you and for me. It's good news for anyone who's ever felt rejected, devalued, or forgotten by society. As Jesus once said, I came to seek and save those who were lost. And Jesus came to a world full of lost people. Not just people who had been lost by society, but people who had lost their way emotionally, spiritually. And maybe that's where you are today. Maybe you feel emotionally, spiritually, relationally lost. Maybe you feel forgotten, abandoned, devalued by the world. And if that's you, then I have good news. That God sees you, that He loves you, and He wants you. As we've talked about before, God is not far from any one of us. In fact, all we need to do is reach out and touch Him. But sometimes it doesn't feel that way. Sometimes it feels like you're abandoned, you're forgotten. But let me tell you right now, I've felt that way. And the way that I have gotten over that, or the way that I've gotten past it, is by reaching out to God, even when I don't feel like it, even when I feel like He is not there for me. Because I found every single time that He is there, that He loves me, that He sees me, and that He hasn't forgotten me. God is always there for you. And the story of abandonment, the story of rejection, that's a bad story. And as we've said last episode, in order to get past those, we have to tell a better story. And the better story that you have today and that I have today is that there's a God who sees you. There's a God that sees me, who loves us, who's there for us and will never abandon us. And so all you need to do is reach out to Him today, because He's already reaching out to you.